have found our way into the Enneagram together. And we are a wonderful community from different schools. You'll meet Colleen and Bill today from the narrative tradition, which we absolutely love. And many of us have been studying at Loyola for quite a long time with Dr. Jerome Wagner. And so it's wonderful to bring the schools together and get to know what each one has to give to the other. So it's a good day. I don't know of too many other regions that have the grace that we do on our board that is filled with people who have learned from various teachers and have been able to say to each other, we want what you have, and so sharing that good grace. So today we're really happy to welcome one of our board members, and Colleen. I think she's still thinking about it because she's a 6, so it might take a little longer, but we have our wonderful friend Bill Reed, who is on our board, and Colleen Reed, who has been a contributor in ways that people don't realize, having helped with our newsletter. And we met at the International Enneagram Association conference this last summer, where I met Bill and Colleen face to face. And so Bill, he jumped right in. He and Colleen were a part of the Enneagram group down in Ohio. And when they moved back to Chicago, they immediately had to find a community of Enneagram enthusiasts. So we're glad to have you today. We're happy that you're going to be talking to us about parenting and grandparenting and the Enneagram. And one of the things that I always like to say to people when they say, well, I'm not a parent, and I don't know if I'll do that part of life. What I always say is you're picking up information that you can offer to others, because you do know people who are wondering about how the Enneagram can inform. So we're grateful that you're here, Bill and Colleen, and so we welcome you. And why don't you tell us a little bit about yourselves and how you learned about the Enneagram?
We moved to Cincinnati, and the person that sold us their house, I met her in a grocery store, and we just started talking, and she said, do you know anything about the Enneagram? Have you ever heard of that? I said no, and she said, oh, that's this really great personality system. And I know Leslie Hirschberger, who I think probably many of you know, and she lives in Cincinnati. And she was offering classes, and she offered to type me. I went in there thinking I was a 7. Turns out I was a counterphobic 6. And after I understood a little bit more about it, I realized I just knew I was a counterphobic 6 when I started talking with her. So Leslie Hirschberger is the one that introduced us to the Enneagram, and we're so grateful that she did.
Yeah.
And Colleen introduced me to the Enneagram, meaning I knew about Leslie. I thought she was a nice person, but I thought this Enneagram stuff was a little too, I don't know, New Age-ish for me, until I actually was given a gift from my wife on Valentine's Day in 2009, where she invited me for a half-day workshop at a university. And I was like, whoa, what? I thought it was a marriage encounter group because there were all couples there that had been sent by their therapist. And but we had a great half-day session. It lit me on fire because I had done all the other personality profiling programs, from Myers-Briggs to DISC to Strength Finders, and all of them told me what I already knew about myself. And it wasn't until the Enneagram that I discovered that I'm the one who had to change. I'm the one who had to understand. And as a 2, I'm very outward in my reactions with interactions with people, and I learned to become, or tried to become, more inward and reflective.
The thing about the Enneagram is that it lets you know, teaches you how or why you do things. That's the thing I think that's most important, is that it makes you understand why things are the way they are with you. And that was very insightful for me.
Well, we found some of your insights really intriguing when you were writing about parenting and grandparenting this month for the newsletter. And so I'm wondering if you could tell us how knowing and practicing the Enneagram has helped you. as parents, as grandparents? How has it helped you?
Well, one thing that I did the other day as I was going through our whole family unit, there's we have 5 children who are all married, and we have 3 grandchildren. So there's a core group of 10 adults and 3 babies, or little children, who are a little bit too soon to identify their types. But it was interesting once we identified and typed all of our children. They had been typed by some of our other friends who are in the Enneagram, as well as I recently typed my one son who had never been typed, and we had all assumed he was a 4, and it ends up he's a 5 with a very strong 4 wing. But it was interesting to see how, those types, and then they looking at the 5 children and who they married. Of all 10 of us, I'm the only heart person. Everybody else is either body or head, which I think just having Colleen and I be different centers, and I have no connection to her center. She has a connection to mine. So I think the beauty of the Enneagram is I learned about how to spend some time in my 5 harmony connection that doesn't really show up on the graph, but in fact, or the chart. But in fact, I think that was very insightful for me.
Well, I think that as knowing now what I know, I could have done a lot different when they were teenagers. But even as adults now, I know that one of our sons in Cincinnati is a 9, and he's married to a 9. And we know not to ever surprise them. They have to have everything planned, so you don't just ever show up at their door or say, "Hey, we're going to meet for dinner." So that is a good thing to know about those 2. And the one that the other he has an identical twin, and the twin, Bill just said he typed him as a 5, and I was completely dumbfounded. I would have thought that kid was a 4. He's very melancholic. Our house in Cincinnati had a beautiful backyard and windows floor to ceiling, and he would go out and sit out there and have his lunch all by himself, which again tells me he's a 5, sort of. I mean, I'm not trying to, but I really thought he always has nice music on. He always has nice things around him. He's melancholic. He's very kind of a romantic kind of thing, but he's also he's very into his siblings, his parents. So anyway, it's always new to me. It's always shocking to me when something like that happens.
Well, I think the biggest adjustment for me, being the only heart person, is that I'm wanting to have connection. And that's obviously with my wife, our children, and I never realized how strong that push toward them was. And as they became teenagers, there was a lot of pushback from me in particular, and I didn't understand it, so I tried even harder to make the connection. And I think because Colleen is a head center, she's in her head all the time, and she imagined all kinds of worst case scenarios with these children, and they definitely put us through the ringer.
Absolutely. I was always in my head, and whenever they were gone at night or whenever,
phone calls or whatever,
I felt like we were on speed dial for the Western Police, because I really felt like they were always, they weren't always in trouble, but I always imagined that they would be.
Yeah.
And Bill would be like, "What are you worried about? They're fine." But I always, oh my gosh.
See, I always
those poor kids.
Yeah.
No, poor kids. Poor.
Poor.
No, I just meant to say I was always in their face about everything. Where are you? What are you doing? And not that they weren't bad.
No, they didn't, but they did push our buttons, and I think that's the thing that instinctually their types were tapping into our type behaviors. And I think, kind of looking in perspective now, all these years later, I realized how, had we knew the Enneagram at the time, both of us would have inserted a pause before we reacted.
Absolutely.
And contemplate a little bit, me especially, because I got very emotional, very angry sometimes when I didn't get the connection that I wanted, or I would do all kinds of things for them.
Yes.
And it wasn't appreciated. So that's kind of puts a
they didn't ask for it.
They didn't ask for it. That was the thing. Colleen always says, you overestimate their interests, and it's now looking back on it, I realize how challenging that must have been for them, because obviously none of them had a heart connection. None of them married heart people. So it's interesting to me, that I'm kind of this lone heart person in this unit of 10 people. And now that I've learned to kind of step back a little bit, I work on it every day. And I don't try to react so quickly. Whereas Colleen is in her head analyzing everything and imagining all kinds of scenarios. So by the time she starts sharing that with me, it's kind of halfway into the conversation she's already had in her head. So I never know what the hell she's talking about either, especially when it comes to when our children do things that aggravate me.
Oh, well. Yeah.
Not that I ever aggravate them. I probably do.
Well, no, that's the thing. And there, sometimes we would be even out shopping, and he'd say, "Oh, I think I'm going to get this for so and so," and I'd say, "Why?" Well, wouldn't that be nice? I guess, but they don't. I mean, how do you know they even want something like that? You're getting it for yourself, not for them. You're getting it because you want a connection with them.
And also, there was that element of pride, which, excuse me, until I learned about the Enneagram, I didn't understand about pride. Like, what do you mean pride? Now I get it. Like I before I do something, I stop for a moment and think, am I doing this truly because this person has asked me to do it? Or I just genuinely want to do it with no strings attached? Or am I doing it because I want a reaction from that person? I want a approval, or I want a thank you. I don't want a lot of fanfare. But if they just take it, whatever it is, whether it's tangible or intangible, like sharing a really heartfelt story and there's no reaction, you're like, what? But then I think, well, why did I share that? Well, they didn't ask to hear about this. It's one of those things where if they ask for your advice is one thing. I offer my advice to them, and oftentimes they're like, whoa, not interested. So
yeah.
Well, so this is really interesting. Our social 2 and our counterphobic 6, and the ways that you offered one another way to see. So even though you didn't know the Enneagram, there was still this wonderful head and heart connection happening with your parenting. And so, I'm wondering, you mentioned that within your immediate family, you have 3 body types, right?
Right.
2, and you have a 1, right? You have 2 guts.
We have 2 1s and a 9
2
in our
1s and a 9.
in the body center.
And then what about in the head?
We have a 5, 6, and 7. It's almost as straight. And then there's
And you're the Lonely Hearts Club.
a little Lonely Hearts Club. I mean, everyone's looking. I don't even have if I were a 3, then we would have a full straight or whatever, but not so much. But the interesting thing about that, let me just interject about the fact that I am in the heart center. I have a connection to the body center because it's a wing of mine, and it wasn't until the Enneagram that I realized just how strong of a wing that was, meaning the need for constantly challenging or perfecting or changing things to be perfect, whatever that perfection means. And I think once I embraced my 1, because I'd always feel comfortable on the 3 side, but not so much on the 1 side, I began to realize that I was doing that for my own, pride, that I wanted things done a certain way. If you wanted them done a certain way, you had to do them yourself because there was that way, and that was an eye-opener, especially with our children. I think as they got older, as teenagers, I expected them to behave a certain way. And I didn't really do much as a teenager, where Colleen did a lot more. So she kind of pushed the limits more than I did, which is ironic since she's a fear-based personality. But she went at that. She went at that fear, where I don't react well to the fear.
That's very true. When the kids would go out on a Friday or Saturday night, I always assumed that one of them wouldn't come home for whatever reason. Both of my parents were killed in car crashes at 10 years apart, 20 years apart.
Yeah.
And so I always assume when the phone rings late at night, there's something wrong. Actually, when the phone rings ever, there's something wrong. So when they would call and say, "Can I stay this place?" and I was, yeah, you can stay there, because I had to just take a deep breath, because that fear really, it was crippling for me, and I think for them too when they were teenagers, because they always thought something was going to go wrong, but it never did.
Yeah, it's interesting when you talk about how they respond to us. I think growing up, they bonded really closely to both of us, but I think with Colleen, there was more of an awareness of her anxiousness or her fear, where with me, it was a different dynamic, because it would require perhaps a different empathy or understanding. And oftentimes Colleen was the filter between our children and me when it came to helping them understand, why am I responding this way? Why do I feel that sense of hurt or disconnection or dismissiveness?
I think that's more now that we understand a little bit more than it was then. I was the conduit, though, that because the kids would ask Bill something, he'd automatically just say no. And then they would come to me, and I was like, gee, I wonder why he said no. So not that has anything to do with the Enneagram, but I think that the fact that we know about it now is it's such a gift. It really is a gift to us. It's a gift to them, more than they even know.
Oh, yeah. And I also think it's a gift to the fact that we've been able to embrace our 5 in-laws in different ways.
Tell us about the Enneagram types or your 4 daughters-in-law and how that's impacted your family dynamic. What does the holiday dinner table look like now? What's that?
Well, it's really fun, I think.
It is fun. One of our children, our daughter, we have 4 boys and 1 girl. She lives in Australia, so we don't see much of her. But she did come in recently for our youngest son's wedding with her husband and child, and we lived with them for 2 weeks. And that was the first time I actually had seen them as a couple on a day-to-day basis. So that was enlightening. But in terms of like the holiday table or whatever, I've learned to step back in particular because I was always in charge of all that. I did all the decorating. I grew up in an environment where I was expected to do that stuff growing up. And Colleen was like, great. I'd make the dinner, she would clean up. I was at the table, she would take, we just worked really well as a couple. Well, our children learned the same dynamic so our boys learned all the skill sets that most boys don't learn. And I think that when they married, a couple of our daughters-in-law, I'm challenged by, only because I think to some degree I'm perhaps too close to my boys on an emotional level, where I think that's kind of their place. I'm not replacing them, their spouse, but it's like they would turn to me for emotional insight, perhaps, of a situation where now they don't do that because they have a wife, and that's fine, And
excuse me a minute. I think that was very hard for you.
Oh yeah.
Because he was very close to them, but they do have a wife, and now they're their places with their wife, and when they talk, they still call and ask for advice. But it's interesting with having two daughters-in-law we have 2 that are 9. Yeah, and our son-in-law. Yeah. So the 9s.
Your sons were looking for peacemakers.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting? That's so interesting. That yeah. So 3 of them.
Yeah, I just find it fascinating. We have 5 of the 10. 5 or half of them are in the body center. 4 of them are in the head center, and 1 is in the heart center. And it's interesting to see who they married and kind of the balance, perhaps. And maybe that's what the attraction was, considering that 4 of our in-laws are 9s, which I think says a lot.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, let's just open up this last part before we open up to questions and responses to what you've said today. But what additional insight and perspective would you like to offer us today when it comes to parenting, to grandparenting, to making space for your adult children to really bond with their spouses, and that just sounds like a wonderful journey that you've been on, to be able to even name what you've experienced, and so I love that Colleen stopped you and said, no, wait, that was really hard for you in the beginning, right? So you're saying that's okay that they're really close to their spouse, but you said, no, Bill, that wasn't okay in the beginning. So give us some additional insight and perspective about this parenting, grandparenting, and understanding your own type and having empathy for the types in your tribe.
Wow. You want to respond to that? Okay.
Oh, yeah, no, go ahead.
I think, from a parenting standpoint, having 5 children within a 6-year time span, and 2 of them being twins, at one point in our life, we had 4 children under the age of 4. Looking back on that, I was the provider. I went out and I worked really hard and made an effort to get home for dinner at least, and oftentimes went back to work so that they could have a big life, everything that perhaps we did not have growing up or wanted our children to have. But I think that effort, that energy that went into that, my type was, I'm going to keep pushing forward. And if I had just maybe sat back a little bit and just let the situation unravel on its own, silly things like making sure everything was just right, my one wing, I think pushed our children away to some degree, because they were never going to be perfect. And I didn't necessarily want perfection from them, but I wanted responsibility and accountability and acknowledgement. And the acknowledgement, I think, is probably the toughest thing. Is, when you're dealing with teenagers, they're not going to necessarily acknowledge you for what you've given them or what you do for them, and what you put up with them. And having 5 teenagers for an entire year, from 13 to 19 years old, it was exhausting on an emotional level for me, and it was exhausting on a fear-based situation with Colleen. So knowing now, looking back on it, I probably would have been less involved, perhaps, in trying to understand that, why are you not responding to me, and sit back and let them kind of breathe in their own space. So now I find myself really trying hard when I'm on the phone with one of them, or I'm in person with one of our children, to be more quiet. That in itself is a growth edge for me, to stop talking. So I'll turn it over to Colleen.
I think that what I would say is to just insert the pause, and not to react, and or need to overreact, or just even to react until you had some until you kind of had more information about what's going on. Our daughter, when she was 17, and when she was 18, she was trying to figure out a major for college. She's the 7, and she said, "I'm going to major in fencing." And I was like,
yeah, right.
Of course, right away, I reacted. "No, you're not. That's crazy." La, 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 la. And if I had just inserted the pause and said, "Wow, Megan, that's a great idea," because then I would know the next week it's going to be something else. It ended up to be journalism. Yeah. So it was fine. But just insert the pause. That's what I would say.
And one last thing I would say is, we had one of our sons, the 5. He highly intense and never realized we were intruding on his space. And I think especially 4 or 5, I've learned that you got to they need to come out, and he would come out and join in when he felt secure and comfortable. But as a teenager, his identical twin was a 9. So he was always kind of balancing everybody in the family, and was able to deal with the extremes much more comfortably than his brother did. And I think the reactivity of us not understanding why one was so charming and easygoing and the other one, identical twins are fascinating.
Well, people make assumptions about them, and
they're still 2 unique people. It's just they happen to share all the same genes. But type-wise, it was a real lesson for us to see the difference between a 5 and a 9, and how they communicated with each other.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, and so a question I want to ask before I open it up to others. You mentioned that you longed for this connection with your kids, but then there was this immediate reaction of saying no, which doesn't sound very 2-like to me. So if we look at Karen Horney's 3 trends, we would see you moving toward and wanting to make that connection. And so it would seem more like a 2, and especially a social 2, would say yes to the children to have that connection. Do you know what that was about?
I think that, excuse me, that reactivity of no was the fact that if they did it the way I wanted them to do it, meaning like I wanted to have the connection with them, and I wanted them to experience this a certain way, whatever the situation was, and they would offer up something totally different. So from the frustration, I guess, in answer to your question is, I would immediately say no, and then when Colleen would talk to me about it afterwards, spending some time in my head center, I'm like, yeah, really, why did I say no to that? because as soon as I said no, I realized I had lost the connection, and it irritated the hell out of me that they would go to their mother.
But you didn't know that.
But I didn't know it at
Right.
the time. But Colleen would come back around, and we always stood as a united front. But oftentimes, after reconsidering the situation, I would then go back to that child and say, I've talked to your mother about this, and I think it's probably a good idea, with maybe a little caveat. But yeah, it is kind of a counterintuitive. Like, why would a two break off the connection? But I think it was more like I didn't give any thought to what they're asking for me. It was just, when you've got 5 people working you all the time, and Colleen used to have this thing, you're never going to break us, no matter what you do. We started this all. You're not going to break us. And it wasn't, I don't think, a meanful, spiteful intention to break us apart, but they could have easily, with what they put us through, pushed us apart. And I think that was the the insight, I guess, I have the most is.
Yeah.
Do you think that your body instinct took over at that moment? You went right to the moving against.
Yes.
With your 8, that there was something with the children that actually brought out your body instinct in the lead that would react rather than connect.
That's so true, Claire, because even in business, I ran businesses for over 40 years. I was in the business community. And when I was under stress or anxious or irritated by people not doing their job correctly, I would immediately go to the dark side of an 8, and I'd become really aggressive and dismissive. The very things that I would not like to have people react to me with. I always was kind of challenged by that. But I found that had I spent some time in the head center, had I just thought about why this was irritating me, or why was I responding, kind of that guttural reaction of like, no. Because a lot of it was based, I think, also on anger, that maybe the prior time we didn't make the right connection. See, Colleen moves on. She doesn't dwell on things, where I can still recall a feeling that I had with one of our children irritating me or upsetting me, and I got to move on from that. And I think that's the part that, it's easier just to be dismissive and cut them off at the pass. And oftentimes when I would say no and they'd leave, I'd regret it. But then I couldn't go immediately to them because I needed some time to.
So that's where that whole pause thing comes in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just to take a breath and think of,
One of the best pieces of advice I ever got from my brother, who's a 9, he said, you don't have to react or respond. If, as far as they do something wrong, you told them not to do it, they did it. My instinctual reaction was immediately respond to that, punishment or whatever it required. He said, you know what, let them stew a little bit about it. Let them see, let them think about what they did, and we'll get back to you. And that was a really powerful transition for the two of us, that we didn't react immediately to some unacceptable behavior. We said, you know what you've done, and we want you to think about it for a while, and we'll get back to you on how we're going to deal with you.
Yeah.
I hated that, by the way.
Yeah. Well, you sound like you have let the pause help you gain your groundedness, help you reflect on your core values, help you stay open and create space to move into another part of parenting, which is called grandparenting. And so I know we love that saying. People will say, if I had known how great grandparenting was, I would have skipped parenting altogether. And gone straight to it.
Right.
So I'm just wondering if our friends from around the Brady Bunch squares have any questions for Bill, the social 2, or Colleen, the counterphobic 6. And so if you would, when you want to ask a question, just raise your hand and then unmute your microphone and introduce yourself and let us know what type you are. That will be how we'll go forward. So time is open. Teresa.
I just like your insight. My name's Teresa McCloy. I'm a 3 on the Enneagram. And I'm going to flip it the other way just a little bit. As a child with 2 parents that are in their 80s, that I have not typed. I might have some guesses, but it would just be a guess. Just, sitting as a 3 and, I guess flipping it around. I know you can't give your insights from your children's perspective because you can't get in their heads, but just that relationship going the other way. What are your thoughts on just even continuing to develop that relationship with my parents now that I have some awareness about myself? Not that they don't have awareness, but yet in that situation. What are your thoughts?
Well, that's a great question. We learned about the Enneagram while my mother was still alive, and my mother, no question, was a 2. And as she aged, and she got closer to, she died when she was almost 91, her type behaviors became even more prominent, to the point where it was driving me nuts, because the very things that I had done to my children, she was now doing to me. It was almost like our roles were reversed. And so what I tried to, dealing with another 2, especially a mother-son relationship, was, it was enlightening from the standpoint that I finally maybe appreciated why she behaved the way she did growing up. There was a lot of passive-aggressive behavior, and I loved my mother dearly. I never realized just how manipulative her interaction was with her 3 children. And not in a bad way, but just, and maybe you can comment, Colleen and I grew up next door to each other, so she knew my mother from the time she was about 5 years old. So maybe from an in-laws perspective.
So you haven't typed your parents, so you don't know.
No, I just see places like in my father coming out that, I'm not sure if it's an 8 or what it is, but just stronger personality characteristics, which I think is very typical as people age. And, Bill, what you said about your mother, but, I'm not sure what their types are, but I just see stronger personalities come out in the last 2 to 3 years. So just wondering about that.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I guess we both had elderly parents, and not Bill knew his mom's type, but I certainly didn't know my stepfather's type. I don't know. I think in dealing with them, my feeling about it is just, again, inserting the pause, taking a breath before you speak, and stepping to be very thoughtful about that when you are with them. That's tough because, that's what that's our whole generation is dealing with our elderly parents now. And so, which is where we're going to be in a few years.
Well, it's interesting, like going back to my mother, my sister is most likely a counterphobic 6. She's never been officially typed, but she's probably more of a phobic 6, And she and my mother really had a difficult time towards the end of my mother's life, because my sister had so much fear in her, and that she was reacting to my mother's need for more connection and wanting to talk to, and it was almost like the more my mother pushed at her, the more my sisters criticized her and kind of pushed back from her. And I think, parents, both of all of our parents are gone now, but I think looking at our children, how they are, I think they've seen that we've changed. I think I'm probably the one that they have the most challenge with, in terms of that I don't react the same way. And when you start changing, the people in your life notice, and how do they react to that? Sometimes they don't want to, they don't like the change. They don't necessarily they expect certain things from me, I guess, and certain things from Colleen. And when we don't react that way, I think they're kind of not sure-footed anymore. Oftentimes I think they like, what? Why is he not, doing everything? And why, just like at a holiday time, in the past, I would be in charge of everything. And I now sit back and let them, they need some help, they'll ask me. And that's so hard.
Bill, you're disrupting the family system. Yeah. It's a disruption. When transformation starts to take place, everyone begins to wonder, what is my place now? I'm used to this reaction. And so you're creating a whole new way of living. And so thanks for that. I'm wondering, are there any other responses or questions from others?
Martha does, Claire.
Martha, welcome. So unmute your video, Martha.
Unmute your audio there, friend. Down in the bottom left, Martha. There's a little mute button. There you go.
So my question is a little more general because I'm new to the Enneagram and don't really understand how to put it in practice in interpersonal relationships. So can you kind of unpack the general sense of how to just use it, how to use the Enneagram in your relationships?
You want to respond to that?
No, you go ahead. I think about that one.
I think from a more general standpoint, I think the centers, the 3 centers, you're trying to better understand from where you come from, whether you know your type or not, how you respond to, where are you most anxious when presented with something that is challenging? Is it in your head? Are you imagining all kinds of scenarios? Is it in your heart, in the feeling center? Or is it in your body where you physically, almost a gut reaction to the situation? And oftentimes when I do my consulting and training, I will get people to think more about their centers first. Like, what center do you feel most comfortable in? And whatever that means in terms of heart, body, or head, we have all of them. It's just what is your primary kind of instinctual response to a situation? Where are you going to feel it the most?
What type are you? Do you know?
I think I'm a 3.
Okay.
God bless you. No, I think, that's a perfect insight, though, as a 3. Maybe Claire or Teresa would like to respond to that. But I, as a heart person, I would say, looking at your behaviors and how you respond to people and how you react to their interaction or not interaction with you. Like, if they're not doing what you expect them to do, or they're not part of the goal, how are you reacting to that?
Beautiful. Well, so I talk to Martha sometimes about such things. So I'd love to have somebody else from the Heart Center speak to that. And any of our other participants from the Heart Center that you'd like to respond, if you just give us a sign.
Or just unmute yourself. If you don't have video, just go ahead and unmute yourself and speak out. And
all right, Teresa, it looks like you're on.
am I the only Heart Center? So besides you, gosh. I think for me, Martha, I found within relationships, it's exactly what Bill said. I think the Heart Center in general is that knowing that I'm not putting an expectation. The 3 sitting in that space is very forward. So I'm not putting expectation on others. I'm not engaging with them in that way that's very forward with that high level of get it doneness that I can expect out of people. So that expectation word can come in, at least for me. And so learning to just to back off, much like Bill was talking, even just to let others do, to be in that place. People will notice that shift and begin to ask you about it. And, but it's a beautiful space to sit into. I love the word that they've been using, to take the pause. I know, and maybe that relates to the heart space a lot. I think it relates to all spaces and types, but I think especially in the heart space with the 2 and the 3.
Beautiful. Thank you, Teresa. So I'm wondering, are there any other questions or responses? Stacy. Welcome, Stacy. Tell us what your type is.
I am Stacy Lemansky, and I'm at 8. And I would just comment that one of the ways that the Enneagram has really helped me in relationships, to my dear friend Martha, is it has allowed me to give increasing measures of grace when I see people living in their false self. So when I have a child who is a 7 and I see them acting out the false self of a 7, instead of responding in extreme frustration, there's a grace that comes that allows me to say, okay, he's a 7, he's acting out of his false self, and I'm able to make that, reasoning in my mind. Or with my daughter who's a 4, and I see some of the parts of her personality and her 4-ness that drive me crazy as an 8. It just allows a lot of grace. So I just wanted to add that.
Nice. Nice.
I think that's beautiful. You're appreciating their uniqueness, but also their unawareness. I mean, that's the one thing when in my training, they talk about waking up. And when you wake up to yourself, it's a little uncomfortable for yourself because you have to start admitting things to yourself that, oh, yeah, I am doing this. So when, someone who's has not advanced to that level, you can, maybe appreciate, or use your term, kind of living in grace, but to step back and realize they have great qualities.
Right.
What you're seeing is that false stuff, which is really more of like a fortress of protection around their ego. And if you can just at least open or crack open an area where you can say, wow, that's pretty amazing, even though inside you're ready to kill them, you just, I've seen that with our kids. You're just like, oh, maybe what they're doing is, how they're reacting to me. And so if I react differently, they have to shift too. And I've actually seen that in conversations and quotes, arguments, whatever. If I just slow down and kind of shape shift myself a little bit and kind of try to look at it from their perspective, all of a sudden it's like, whoa, this never even occurred to me. It's like Clare has talked about, we look at 9 different viewpoints. We all have those in us, but one situation and 9 different reactions to that same situation, which I find fascinating.
Yeah.
It is fascinating. I want to just do a couple of things before we have a closing meditation. The first thing I'd like to say is thank you, William and Colleen, for sharing yourselves so generously with us and being willing to say where you feel like it didn't go so well. And because as soon as we can be present to all that is, we can open up to all that we haven't seen yet. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of humility, which is the virtue for the 2, right? And for Colleen, courage to say, that's the virtue for the 6, that brings both of you back to the truest thing about you. And that is that you're made in the image and likeness of this wonderful creator, and that this divine spark actually has space to show up through humility and courage. And so we thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And so we have just started. This is only our 2nd time on, but the next time we're hoping to actually shift from Wednesdays to a Friday, because Jerry Wagner can't do Wednesday. He teaches a class. So just be watching both our newsletter and your email, and we'll let you know what's going to be happening in February with Dr. Jerome Wagner. You're not going to want to miss that. And I would move to Friday for him any day of the week. So we'll make that happen. And then also, if you're not a part of our newsletter, if you could just let Teresa know, let her know that you'd like to be a part of the newsletter. We have some great events coming up this spring and summer that you're going to want to mark your calendars and see if you can be a part of that. The work that Bill does with his consulting firm out of Chicago, that will be on in an email. Teresa will let us know what Bill's contact information is in case anyone would like to consult with him. Enneagram Chicago. We appreciate that that kind of networking, that we can introduce people to really good practitioners that can help on the journey. And so if there are no other nuts and bolts, Teresa, I'd like to close us in a meditation.
If I think Erica is going to post it real quick, our Enneagram email for the Great Lakes. That's a great place. If you have a question, if you want follow up to this, there, she just posted it in the chat. You might want to save that email, put it in your contact list. And that way, if you have questions of anything that's upcoming, we check that not daily, but 2 or 3 times a week. And we'll get back with you on, if you want to know something about an event or further contact with Bill, that type of thing, any question, that's where you could use that email address and we'll follow up with you.
Yeah, and thank you to Teresa and Erica for making this possible through the technological world. We're really grateful for you guiding us and holding us steady in the process and making this dream come true of having an online community that could grow if we start to invite people. So if we could begin to do that, think about people that you know that are benefiting from this wonderful mapping tool called the Enneagram. And if you would like to recommend to us someone that would be a great guest on this program, we'd love to hear about that too. And so with that, I'd like to invite you to just get comfortable in your chair and put everything down. And if it's good for you to close your eyes or to utilize a soft gaze, I am looking out at the snow in Michigan, which is really lovely and still. It's beautiful. And just begin to breathe. Giving thanks that right now you have breath in your body. That there is a sign of life in you today. That you're here now, feet on the floor, legs uncrossed, feeling the goodness of the earth and the grace of gravity. Just begin to notice the chair and where your body is touching the chair, where your feet are touching the ground. And experience the support of this moment. And breathing in gratitude. Noticing if there's any place in your body that's tight or holding stress. And see if you can breathe into that space and create an expanse. Little loosening up of the tension. We've talked about a lot of things today. You've probably thought of relationships in your life, some that feel easy and some that are more difficult. Even as that relationship is coming up on the screen of your mind, just allow yourself to breathe in compassion for the self. And that you know things now that you could never have known until you know them. And so breathe in and receive some ease. That the reality that you're waking up to some things is a sign that you're alive and that you have another option. And that with these relationships, you can pause and you can breathe. And you can allow this awareness or this awakening of your automatic responses to just expand a little bit, let go a little bit. That in the pause and in the breathing, you can choose another way. And I want to encourage you to just breathe in through the crown of your head and down to the soles of your feet. And breathe in from the soles of your feet up to the crown of your head. recognizing that you have all three centers of intelligence. You have access to your body intelligence, your emotional intelligence, and your head intelligence. Or in our words with motions of the soul, we say IQ, EQ, and GQ. And taking the time to check in with all three centers of your harmony triad, 147, 258, or 369, that you'll be able to take the pause, be able to wake and offer yourself compassion and offer the other empathy. And in this way, we look like our Creator. Fully present, fully awake, open and receptive, and full of grace. And in my tradition, we would end a meditation like this saying, Amen. So thanks for joining us today. Bless you all. Bye-bye. Okay, friends, it's the post-meeting meeting. Can you unmute, Teresa, Erica?
I'm here.
Hang on, I'm going to stop recording here just a second.